say about the evolution of Indian society or Indian culture. That is very important. The third thing is why we need to understand Savarkar and why we need to go beyond worship. Now, this is an intrinsic problem to a lot of civilizational heroes that we have. We can think of Swami Vivekanand among the latest ones. We can think of people like Bhagat Singh. We can think of people like even Ambedkar among people who celebrate him. There is a tendency to reduce them to a approach of worship in which you understand the greatness of the person and you like go over their work and go over their lives, but you don't try to connect what they said to the present moment as it is unfolding. The problem there is that this creates a very passive understanding of a person. Like you have a portrait of a person and like 100 people are celebrating him, but what about putting his thought into action? So, as far as Savarkarite understanding is concerned, it is not limited to worship. We have to go beyond worship to practice. We have to refine and we have to think of it as a tradition. Savarkar is not cannot be considered even within Savarkarite understanding. Savarkar cannot be considered culmination of a kind of thought. Savarkar is a initiator of that kind of thought, and if that tradition is to continue, then a lot of people who have the caliber of Savarkar, if not more than Savarkar, those people are needed to continue that tradition. That is the idea of recognizing greatness, but not reducing it to worship. And the fourth point is kind of connected with the worship part, that you cannot just intellectually or in a very literary sense or in a very historical sense appreciate Savarkar. If you appreciate him, then you must apply his thought, and you should think of his thought as guiding light in your intellectualism, in your maybe art. You can think of him as a guiding light for your art, in literature, in activism. So all of these avenues are possible. That is exactly why I said ki whatever I'm going to say here today, it is not like an answer to something. It is not a presentation in that sense of the term. It is more like a guide to how, in a very experimental and application sense, how do we understand what Savarkar exactly said and where do we go from there. One framework that we come back to when we talk about Savarkar in the study circle or even Ambedkar is that both Savarkar and Ambedkar were ahead of their time. What this means is that both of these people realized something about India as it existed in that point of at that point of time. They realized something which a lot of other people at that time did not realize. So everything else that they have said or written or did has to be considered from this perspective, that they their understanding of India was not limited to their own time, that they were able to refine their understanding to certain principles which are somewhat timeless in nature. These are what we call great intuitions. They had some of these great intuitions which can continue to guide us today if we have this perspective, if we are able to bridge this gap between them and us. Now, what exactly are these great intuitions? I have written these down. I wrote a lot of things down, but I was able to refine them and then like reduce them to merely 5 points. I would be glad if some of you can suggest an addition or even a subtraction. I would appreciate that. But currently, I think these five can serve as a kind of introduction, not just introduction, but a very valid summary of Savarkar's thinking, all of Savarkar's thinking about India's past, present, and future. We will go through them one by one. Again, I would request that those of you who are able to please note these down. These are things that we repetitively hear and we read them, but it is very rarely that we think through what exactly do these things mean, what is the depth of these things. So, if any thought comes to your mind while going through these, do note them down, and we can discuss that later. So, the first intuition. Now, I'm sure that most of you must have read some of Savarkar's work. Even you have not, then you must be familiar with the concept of Hindutva. Some of you who are more prolific might have actually read Hindutva, the text, and also his other work on history, and his other work on that contemporary history, but also like six glorious epochs. So all of these taken together, and it is crystallized in a very functional sense in that text when he writes about Hindutva. So a lot of what I'm going to say is informed by that text, but what I have tried to do is to kind of summarize and create some kind of seeds of thought, which can be a guide to almost like everything that Savarkar thought. So the first intuition that we can see here is that Savarkar granted recognition of Hinduism not merely as a religious faith, but as a comprehensive cultural, and national identity. Uh, this seems rather obvious, especially for people who have read Savarkar. But to appreciate the depth of this statement, you have to almost all of Hindu history. What do we mean by Hinduism, or what does the word Hindu denote? Does it merely represent a spiritual point of view, or does it represent something more? When we speak about Hinduism as civilization, extending far back into the past, and the moment when we use the word civilization, this word is timeless. So we are talking about Hinduism in its past, in its present, as well as in its future. The moment we use the word civilization, we are starting to prove our national life in multiple dimensions, only one of which is religious. There is also the social dimension, there is also the material dimension. All of these things are contained within the idea of civilization itself. So, when Savarkar speaks about Hinduism as not mere faith, but as a cultural and national identity, so the radical idea that he is proposing here is that the questions concerning Hinduism, or rather the content of Hinduism, they cannot be reduced merely to the theological side. The social concerns, the cultural concerns, the political concerns, even the material concerns like poverty, even these kind of concerns. In today's times, we would advance even more concerns. Uh, Whatever new concerns come up from a civilization point of view, so long as these concerns are central to Hindus, they must be concerned within the ambit of Hindutva. That is why Hindutva, in his definition, is not restricted to the religious Hindu identity, but becomes a cultural and national identity. So, in conclusion, what Savarkar is advancing is the expansion of belief that Hinduism is not merely a religious identity, but a wholesale program of civilization itself: material, social, and metaphysical. All three of these are contained within uh, the Hindu scheme of things. If not for this, just think about this. If we do not admit this, then how exactly would we propose nationalism as a Hindu concern. Somebody could argue that Hinduism, the nationalism, is the ideology of nationalism is restricted to territorial aspects or like physical or social aspects of things. So it cannot be considered Hindu in its essence. But as far as Savarkar is concerned, even these concerns, which are at the core of Hindu society, so long as they have Hindus at their center, they must be admitted within the Hindu scheme of things. The second intuition that we get from Savarkar, again, this may seem rather obvious that essence of Hindu civilization to be seen through a lens of dynamic continuity rather than static tradition. But it is not obvious. Within Hinduism, we see the idea of a paradigmatic past. What this means is that we consider some remote time to be a period of great excellence, to be a period of ideals in all things, when society was ideal, when polity was ideal, when, let us say, economics was ideal. So, this is an idea of paradigmatic past in which we consider some remote antiquity to not just be our ideal greatness, but also to be the parameter for judging future greatness. The problem with paradigmatic past is if we consider our greatness only to lie in the past, then it considers our present action passive. It also makes all of our future vision in some sense restricted to our idea of past. Savarkar broke through this idea. In this sense, Savarkar is a radical, almost evolutionary personality because he is breaking through a very traditionalist and conservative model of thought, and he's looking at the essence of civilization in in the ways in which it makes sense of the present and the ways in which it evolves. So, against the idea of paradigmatic past, in which we restrict our glory, our greatness, our excellence to some model of the past, he is kind of opening the future, that all of this greatness can actually lie in the future, that it is possible that all of our past greatness will pale in comparison to our future greatness. So what we see here are two things: that the future opens up to the potential of greatness, but also we start looking at almost everything, our social organization, our political organization, our even our religious idols. We start looking at all of these things in a evolutionary perspective, that they are not fixed in their time, that almost all of these things will have to face the question of change, and we will have to make them evolve. So that is the essence of the second intuition. This third intuition concerns Savarkar's work on Hindu nationalism and Indian nationalism. Savarkar sought congruence of Hindu nationalism with India, providing an abiding blueprint for the Indian nation. To appreciate this point, you have to look at other ideas of Indian nationalism. Now, there is the Gandhian idea of Indian nationalism, in which India is sort of like a community, which at one point of time starts calling itself a nation. So that community of people naturally evolves into a nation. As far as Nehru is concerned, Nehru thought of India as a palimpsest, that a ground on which a lot of people came, they assimilated, and that even Nehru's understanding of India is civilizational, but it is very different from Savarkar. For Savarkar, now think of, before starting with this, now think of the history of Indian nationalism. Even going far back before Gandhi's time, we know for a fact that all of the great Indian nationalists who were at the forefront of national movement, they were not just thinking about political questions. All of these were also thinking about social questions. Think of people like Tilak. or Lala Lajpat Rai, or people from Bengal like Netaji. All of these people were not merely political personalities. They advanced their thought in social questions also, because that colonial period for India was not merely a period of political organization, but also of social organization and cultural organization. We see a very intimate relationship between nationalism at that point of time and Hinduism, because it was the resource of Hinduism which was mobilized to create the Indian nationalist movement. You see this in not only people like Tilak, but also the person who succeeded the most in this project, that is Gandhi himself. Gandhi was able to create this grand nationalist project only by uh, mobilizing the resources that were contained within Indian culture, which is to say, within Indian religion. The idea of Ram Rajya, or his insistence on the religious idea of Satya and Ahimsa, all of this shows. And if you compare it to other nationalist movements, like, let us say, China, we do not have that same kind of intimate relationship between religion and nation in China, but we have that in India. That is why Hinduism was at the core of nationalist thought in the colonial period. What Savarkar does is, Savarkar takes this idea to its logical conclusion. He says that the blueprint of Indian nation that you see evolving, this blueprint is not something random, but it is the latent idea that has always been present in Hindu culture, that a nation exists, that Hindus create a nation organically, that this nation can now come into being and it should be identified very, very in a very robust sense with Hinduism. That is Savarkar's idea. So, what was already latent in the Indian nationalist movement, Savarkar only takes that to its logical conclusion. That is why this congruence of Hindu nationalism with India. What this does for Hinduism is that all of Hindu history, as far as the political side of it is concerned, Savarkar gives a definite conclusion to that history. That all of it is culminating in the formation of a political identity of the nation state. What it does to India is that it gives a very stable identity, a pre existing identity to India, that a blueprint of a nation was already existing and now it has come into force. Now it can be applied. So that is why this idea of congruence between Hindu nationalism and India, it has to be understood in the ways that it defines Hinduism as well it defines India. That is the essence of his third intuition. All of these intuitions have been concerned with the conclusions that Savarkar reached after dealing with the raw material of history which was available in his own time. But that is not enough, because Savarkar was not merely a philosopher, he was also an activist. So, after determining that there is such a thing as a Hindu nation, then what exactly is needed? So Savarkar prescribes the need for a proactive approach to save Hindu identity and to save Indian sovereignty. And this is a very important thing. As far as Savarkar is concerned, both of these things are one and the same. You have to think of these things in the perspective of debates regarding the question of Muslims at that point of time. So, as far as Savarkar is concerned, saving Hindu identity and Hindu sovereignty is the equivalent of saving Indian sovereignty. Indian sovereignty cannot be saved without preserving Hindu identity, and Hindu identity cannot feel secure if, at that point of time, it does not give itself to the project of Indian sovereignty. And obviously, all of these things are not merely intellectual in nature. There is need for a proactive political, social, and cultural approach to safeguard both Hindu identity and Indian sovereignty. What exactly should this approach be? That is the subject of his fifth great intuition. The fifth point is that this approach should cater to the evolving needs of Hindu society in the face of external domination and internal fragmentation. The question of external domination before independence can be considered merely the question of colonialism, that someone else is here and you do not exercise freedom of any kind, no economic freedom, no political freedom. You cannot take decisions that affect your lives yourself, and you have not been able to create a nation on your own terms, on your own freedoms. That is the question of external domination. But after independence, obviously, this question of external domination also includes the question of Pakistan, East and West, on both sides. And since the question of Hindu society is concerned here, the problem is not merely external threats. The problem is also the question of internal fragmentation. This is regarding the question of caste, the question of region, as well as the religious and sectarian differences. If you look at Savarkar's activism all of his life, there are multiple phases. People recognize two phases like pre Kala Pani and post Kala Pani. But if you understand all of these intuitions as they became clear to Savarkar, then actually there is no contradiction in Savarkar the revolutionary and Savarkar the Hindu ideologue. There is no contradiction between Savarkar the person who dedicated his life to Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar the anti-caste activist. All of these intuitions mean that all of this life, there are no contradictions here. All of this is part of just one unfolding project. Savarkar's question concerned with internal fragmentation was, you can see that in his comments on caste, in his comments on regionalism, in his comments concerning the language question. All of that is how Savarkar evolved his ideas with time regarding how best to address the question of internal fragmentation. Because there is, as far as Savarkar is concerned, there is nothing final about achieving Hindu unity. All of these questions of caste, region, language, ethnicity, so long as these questions have power, then any Hindu unity that has been achieved is fragile in nature. And as far as that intuition is concerned, we see that this is relevant even to this day. There is nothing in Hindu political organization on social organization or cultural organization that can be considered final, because all the sources of internal fragmentation, none of them have been resolved yet. Now, after these five intuitions that we see from Savarkar, what exactly are the implications here? What exactly are the implications to us today? What exactly are the action points that we can get from all of these intuitions? That is what I will address in the next part of the presentation. The very first part is that, first of all, we should achieve at intellectual level a certain sort of a basic sense of clarity regarding all of these points that have been addressed previously. But after that clarity has been achieved, this should not be limited to mere speculation or philosophy. This intellectual framework or groundwork, it should lead us to a practical movement aimed at revitalizing Hindu society. Why do I use the word revitalization? Because as far as Savarkar's understanding is concerned, and if people who read him clearly and who reach the same conclusions that he did, then Hindu society has been drained of its energy, of its vitality. That is why the need to rethink, rework, and re energize, and therefore to revitalize. So, as soon as the intellectual clarity is achieved, then in Savarkar's agenda, people should get to work. People should people should work on intellectual level. People should work on political level, at activist level, even at the level of literature. But these intellectual points should not remain purely philosophical or speculative in nature. The second great intuition is that all of Hindu society, and when I say the word Hindu here, I am using the Savarkarite sense. All of Hindu society should have a very bold and pragmatic orientation towards political action with emphasis on assertive nationalism and cultural resurgence. The importance of a pragmatic and bold orientation towards political action, as recognized by Savarkar, is you can have a bold pragmatic orientation towards society also, towards culture also, and all of that is needed. But politics is important because politics is very legible. You can create benchmarks of what is to be achieved in politics. You can come together for something legible because political power is legible. Elections are legible. Political goals are legible. The political conversation that you have, the bills that parliament passes, all of these are legible. So all of this creates a sort of framework of working together and using the political means towards greater ends. Politics was an obsession for Savarkar not because he thought of politics as the ultimate end, but politics was thought of as like the bare minimum that has to be achieved so that other changes can take place. So politics in Savarkarite sense is kind of a recipe for working together and for achieving certain desirable ends, which can secure not just political ends but also cultural, social, and all of these kinds of ends. In this sense, you can think of removal of Article 370 or the political imperative that was needed for the successful rebuilding of Ram Temple. All of these are examples where politics was the key achievement, which in turn led to achievement on cultural and social front. So politics here has to be practiced in a very bold and pragmatic way. Politics cannot be reduced merely to legislative activity or a bureaucratic activity, but it has to be seen as the revitalizer of Hindu civilization itself. In this sense, all of Hindutva today, all of the Hindutva vocabulary in politics today, all of it owes a lot to Savarkar's intuitions. The third implication that comes from Savarkar is that we have to address the question of change in Hindu society. We cannot be merely past oriented. We cannot merely imitate our past in sense of its glory, in its excellence. We must continuously look at the evolution as it is happening, not just in India, but in the world around us. And all of this transformative potential, it has to be looked in a positive way. All of the changes that we see, it has to be looked at in a certain positive way, and all of it has to be harnessed not only in changing ourselves but in changing ourselves in such a way that we advance ourselves materially, socially, and culturally as well as theologically. For this you just have to think of like what Savarkar did with Hindutva as a political ideology. Savarkar could have gone back to, let us say, Chanakya or the Gupta Empire or any other glorious period of Hindu polity, and he could have said that that was our achievement, greatest achievement. And it is not that he did not do so. He did go back to them, but he went back to them only for inspiration. He knew that what was needed at his in his time, that is that a kind of ideology that would clear away the confusion regarding Hindu identity and which would bring Hindus politically together. That was not something which has been done previously in Hindu society. It could not have been done because all of these ideas, all of these vocabulary, all of that was available to us only at that point of time. So Savarkar took inspiration from past, he took the essence of the past, but he created something new. This Savarkar's ideal of political unity. the idea that Hindus create one politically united entity. This is not something that you find in Manusmriti. This is not something that you find in Chanakya. In this way, Savarkar inaugurated a very new kind of thinking, a new kind of tradition, and he did so without disparaging the past. So that is the idea of harnessing transformative potential, not just in ideas, but in many other ways, economic ways, social ways, cultural ways, to uplift Hindus and India as a whole. So the essence of this implication is that we must be able to look at whatever changes happen in a positive way, and we should deal with all of this change on the ground of Hindu identity, robust Hindu identity, and Indian sovereignty. So all of these three implications are drawn directly from Savarkar's intuitions. These would sound somewhat abstract to they might sound somewhat abstract to you. The goal here is that if we understand Savarkar at this level, then we can apply him to almost anything. We can apply these insights to political thought, we can apply these insights to uh, cultural thought, we can apply these insights to social evolution, the question of caste, the question of Indian nationalism. We can apply these insights even to the question of development in India. So that is the broad idea here. Because Savarkar's understanding, if completely appreciated at this level, it can be used not just in politics but also in culture, for activism, in social thought, in art, in literature. All of these things are open to us. And we can't actually forget that Savarkar himself was a great playwright, a great poet. So the last slide that I have here is merely uh, a stanza uh, from his poem Majhe Mrityupatra. That is like my final testament. So what Savarkar says here in a very poignant way. All of that poem is Savarkar's reminiscence of his own life. And something interesting you see in Savarkar is that he always has this exultant, a very illuminating attitude to the idea of youth. uh, all of his all of this work regarding Hindutva, in a way, it was an answer to people who thought that Indian civilization is old and ancient. He wanted to prove that Hindu civilization is ever young. So that is why you see in his literature, in his poems, a lot of evocation of youth. And after the evocation of youth, you also see a evocation to like permanent sense of duty. That is why this stanza from his poem, in which he is talking about India in a very poignant way. From Himalayas to ocean, the nation has risen, has assumed the valor, giving up the stance of deprivation. The Yagya pyre initiated is burning vigorously, but so is the resolve of devotees. Even in this small fragment of a poem, you see Savarkar's idea of duty, but also his orientation to the future. His concern is not limited to the past. His dedication, his orientation is to the future. I thought this would be a fitting end to this presentation, in which I have talked about Savarkar as a visionary, as an exemplar of Hindu thought, as veritably the prince of Indian nationalism. Now that this presentation is over, I think we can take a few questions. You can even add your comments. They need not merely be questions. You can add your comments. You can just raise your hand. Okay, so I think Ravi Bhai's hand here. Yeah, please go ahead, Ravi Bhai.
Priyank bhai, so basically, is there anything on governance or business principles that we can take from his framework of thought? For a reason, he was also supporting industrialists. Now we say that Swami Vivekananda has interacted with Tata, have built like all those. So, are there any such instances that we need to recall and pass?
Uh, इसमें मतलब we can talk about this in two ways. complementary ways. One is that I did not address this question here because this was thoda sa beyond the realm of this presentation. But Savarkar was a high modernist. Savarkar embraced the modern vision of a nation in which the material dimension that is concerned with economics is like paramount. So even for the questions concerning like Indian sovereignty, strong Indian polity, all of these questions are in a way concerned with economics. So you can't expect Savarkar to directly give a economic thought, but even at the level at which he has spoken about the need for identity, sovereignty, all of these things require a certain vision of economics. So that is not something which you will find in his work. That is something which can be built on as another layer on top of this idea that I have presented, like what are the needs that Indian society and Hindu society will demand. Second thing that I have here is that Savarkar was very insistent on the values of yeah, Savarkar did have an economic program, but you can't directly apply it here. If you look into his work, then there is an outline of an economic program. Vardhaman has, I think, Vardhaman can share a link to that maybe, or we can discuss this in the group. But the second thing I was saying was that this insistence on the idea of need for economic, not just economic, the technological and scientific innovation, that is very important to Savarkar. So that also gives you a kind of a economic framework. So from the this underlying layer of what is needed for the society and the nation state, you can, and taking the outline of economic framework that he had in mind, you can always build let us say Savarkarite vision of Indian economics. This is something that I was anyway looking forward to discussing with in our second horizon lecture with Harsh Madhusudan. That what would, if you think of a Savarkarite sense of Indian state, what would be the economic statecraft that would be needed to keep this Indian state in its Savarkarite sense afloat? So I think that is somewhere where your question can also come in. Arindam, please go ahead.
प्रेम जी नमस्ते।
Namaste.
अ, म- हाँ, मेरा एक सवाल है कि सावरकर जी ने उनके जो राइटिंग्स है जैसा कि सिक्स ग्लोरियस इपॉक्स वहां पर उन्होंने इंडियन सिविलाइजेशन वैल्यूज जो हैं उनको भी उन्होंने क्रिटिसाइज किया। जैसे मतलब उनके राइटिंग्स में ऐसा है कि जो इंडियन किंगडम्स हैं वो जो अरबिक किंगडम्स है उनको कभी चैलेंज करने के लिए गया ही नहीं। वो एक टेरिटरी के अंदर अपने आप को लिमिट करके रखा। इस तरह से सावरकर जी हर एक स्टेप में इंडियन सिविलाइजेशनल वैल्यूज को भी क्रिटिसाइज किया टुवर्ड्स बेटरमेंट। इसके ऊपर आपका क्या टेक है कि मतलब ही इज टुवर्ड्स क्रिटिकल टुवर्ड्स इंडियन सिविलाइजेशनल वैल्यूज।
इस पे मैंने जो थोड़ी देर पहले एक ये पॉइंट आया था, कहाँ गया, हाँ, तो यहाँ पे एक ये पॉइंट आता है मेन कि सावरकर के लिए इंडियन सिविलाइजेशन वैल्यूज आर नॉट सेट इन स्टोन। सावरकर के लिए इंडियन, जैसे वो बता रहे हैं ना, तो दैट इज वन एग्जांपल ऑफ दैट विच यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट, कि एक हिस्टोरिकल वो एग्जांपल हो गया। उसके अलावा सावरकर ने बहुत जगह और बहुत सारी वैल्यूज को भी क्रिटिसाइज किया है। बट अगर हमें ये समझना है कि सावरकर क्या बोलना चाह रहे हैं, अब एग्जैक्टली कुछ स्पेसिफिक इंस्टांसेस में वी कैन रिजेक्ट मतलब उनकी थिंकिंग, बट ओवरऑल जो है उनकी थिंकिंग यहाँ पे ये है कि वी कैन नॉट थिंक ऑफ इंडियन वैल्यूज इन ए स्टैटिक सेंस कि हमारी वैल्यू एक्स वाई जेड यहाँ पे किसी ने लिखी थी तो ये थी, नहीं। उनका कहने का मतलब ये है कि एज पर द इवॉल्विंग नीड्स ऑफ टाइम, civilization जो है will have to evolve, तो those values will have to change. Those values should be critically identified with ourselves. We should never lose this perspective कि we should imitate someone else ऐसे blindly, but we should not only imitate past. That is the main thing here. That is the main difference between thinking of our civilization in sense of like एक paradigmatic past, कि past में जो है एक मतलब गोल्डन पीरियड था, उसके जैसे ही हमें हमेशा करते रहना है, और फ्यूचर हमारा अच्छा तब होगा जब हम उसको पास्ट जो गोल्डन था उसको पूरी तरह इमिटेट कर लेंगे, नहीं। हमारा जो फ्यूचर गोल्डन होगा वो पास्ट जो गोल्डन पीरियड था उससे काफ़ी डिफरेंट ही रहेगा। ये सावरकर की इंसाइट है। तो एक सेंस में सावरकर इज एक्चुअली पोजिंग ए क्वेश्चन टू द इंटेलेक्चुअल फ्रेमवर्क ऑफ हिंदू सोसाइटी कि आप नई वैल्यूज क्रिएट करते रहिए। एंड अगर आप मेरा पर्सपेक्टिव पूछेंगे तो मेरा तो ऐसा बोलना है कि इवन व्हेन यू गो बैक टू द वैल्यूज दैट ही इज क्रिटिसाइजिंग, तो दोज वैल्यूज देमसेल्व्स वर एक इवॉल्व वर्जन ऑफ सम प्रीवियस वैल्यूज। There is literally nothing in any living civilization which can be said to be, except for like some metaphysical essence, जो हमारे यहाँ हो सकता है कुछ वैदिक हो, थोड़ा पौराणिक हो। उसके अलावा हम लगभग किसी भी चीज़ को ऐसा नहीं बोल सकते कि उसका फ्रेमवर्क हमारे यहाँ ऐसा, मतलब किसी ऋषि मुनि ने एकदम परमानेंट बोल दिया है तो वैसा ही फिक्स्ड रहेगा, ऐसा नहीं है। वो हमेशा इवॉल्व करते रहना पड़ेगा। दैट इज़ वाई ये जो हमारे यहाँ एक्टिविटी थी ना, जो ऋषि वाली एक्टिविटी थी, ऋषि क्या था? ऋषि हमारे यहाँ सिविलाइजेशन का सबसे टॉप मोस्ट इंटेलेक्चुअल था कि ही वुड सी कि क्या क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं, उन क्वेश्चंस को डिफाइन करके ही वुड गिव आंसर्स। तो दैट नीड इज स्टिल देयर टुडे। तो ऋषि का काम एक्चुअली खत्म नहीं होता है। ये बेसिकली वही क्वेश्चन है कि हमें नए नए ऋषि बार बार पैदा करने पड़ेंगे।
अ, क्या हम लोग क्या मतलब जो सावरकर है और गांधी जी, तो इन दोनों के बीच में क्या कोई हार्मोनाइज कर सकते हैं? बिकॉज गांधी जी भी अपने जो मैक्सिमम वैल्यूज है वो इंडियन सिविलाइजेशन से ही ड्रॉ किया, इंडियन धर्म से। तो क्या हम इन दोनों के बीच में हार्मोनाइज कर सकते हैं?
ये क्वेश्चन थोड़ा सा, मतलब इसमें बहुत ज़्यादा डीप हम बात कर सकते हैं, बट अगर एकदम सुपरफिशियल लेवल पे बोलें तो आई थिंक जैसे जैसे हम टाइम में आगे बढ़ रहे हैं ना, जैसे अभी देर नाउ देर आर 70 years सिंस इंडिपेंडेंस, मोर देन 70 in fact. तो वी आर गैदरिंग एक्सपीरियंस, वी आर गैदरिंग a lot of changes which are making us rethink almost everything about our past. जैसे मेरा ऐसा मानना है कि इंडियन फ्रीडम मूवमेंट जो है उसका जो एक हम लोगों ने प्रोटोटाइप बना लिया है कि पहले प्री गांधीयन एक फेज था, फिर गांधीयन फेज था, फिर पोस्ट गांधीयन फेज था। मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि ये वाला जो आइडिया है ये चले जाएगा। एंड what you will see over time is कि there is a pantheon of people like Gandhi, people like Savarkar, people like Ambedkar, all of whom had at the center of their thinking Indian nation. उनकी अप्रोचेस अलग थी। अब एक और चीज करनी पड़ेगी कि व्हेन वी आर रीथिंकिंग वी विल हैव टू अप्लाई एक सर्टेन काइंड ऑफ क्रिटिकल लेंस टू दीज पीपल कि इनके अंदर ऐसा क्या था कि जो अच्छा है और इनके अंदर ऐसा क्या था जो त्यागना पड़ेगा। तो इन मैनी वेज जो गांधी की वैल्यू उस समय आत्मसात की हमारी सोसाइटी ने, देवर ए रिफ्लेक्शन ऑफ उस समय की सोसाइटी की वीकनेस। सोसाइटी उस समय एकदम गरीब थी, सोसाइटी मेटीरियली, सोशली, पॉलिटिकली वीक थी। तो इट इज पॉसिबल कि गांधी को उस समय अमरीश आसानी से कर लिया गया हो। But what you find is कि as society revitalizes, as it gathers its strength, then it finds कि past में जो voices हमें पहले बोल रही थी, कि पहले हम गांधी की बात को ज़्यादा समझ पा रहे थे, बट अभी कुछ गांधी की बातें हमें, मतलब आत्मसात हम नहीं कर सकते हैं। अब सावरकर इज लुकिंग थोड़ा सा मोर इल्यूमिनेटिंग। तो आई थिंक कि जो नया फ्रेमवर्क आएगा इसमें ये सारा जो पैंथियन है ना, जो लास्ट ग्रेटनेस हम कंसिडर कर सकते हैं कॉलोनियल पीरियड की, तो इनके इक्वेशंस जो हैं वो चेंज हो गए। बट ओवरऑल लेवल पे आई थिंक वी विल बी एबल टू हार्मोनाइज देम, बिकॉज ये जो नया फ्रेमवर्क आएगा इट विल बी थोड़ा सा, मतलब ओरिएंटेड टुवर्ड्स ट्रूथ, एंड इट विल बी ओरिएंटेड टुवर्ड्स द वाइटैलिटी दैट वी हैव इन अस। तो अगर मैं एग्जांपल दूं तो गांधी जी का जो रीथिंकिंग था अराउंड इंडियन सोसाइटी, कि इंडियन सोसाइटी हैज टू लीव अनटचेबिलिटी बिहाइंड, इंडियन सोसाइटी हैज टू बी ओरिएंटेड टुवर्ड्स ट्रूथ। एंड गांधी का ओरिएंटेशन लाइक कि देयर इज दिस क्वालिटी इन हिंदुइज्म इट कैन टेक ऑल सेक्शंस ऑफ सोसाइटी टुगेदर, इवन द शेड्यूल्ड कास्ट। ये वाला जो गांधी का सोशल साइड है, आई थिंक वी विल स्टार्ट अप्रिशिएटिंग दैट। बट गांधी की जो पॉलिटिकल वैल्यूज थी उनमें और सावरकर की पॉलिटिकल वैल्यूज में, उसमें तो बहुत ज्यादा एडवर्सरियल रिलेशन है। उसमें मुझे लगता है कहीं ना कहीं सावरकर की वैल्यूज विल विन द मोर सोसाइटी गेन्स स्ट्रेंथ एंड द मोर वी रिवाइटलाइज आवरसेल्व्स। Are there any more questions? वर्धमान इज राइटिंग ए लॉट इन कमेंट सेक्शन. आप बोल भी सकते हो वर्धमान. मतलब दिस इज ए डिस्कशन, यू कैन प्रेजेंट वट एवर यू आर सेइंग हियर ऑल्सो. अच्छा, नॉइज है. ओके. सो डू वी हैव एनी मोर क्वेश्चंस और एनी कमेंट्स और डिस्कशन के पॉइंट्स? If we don't have any more questions, I think we can finish the presentation. तो हाँ, वर्धमान बोल रहे हैं कि फर्स्ट इंट्यूशन में हमें क्लियर करना होगा. व्हाट इज द फर्स्ट इंट्यूशन? अच्छा, हाँ, इस पे हम और आगे बात कर सकते हैं. एक्चुअली व्हाट आई एम गोइंग टू डू इज, दिस वाज जस्ट अ प्रेजेंटेशन. I'm going to refine this presentation and like present it as a text, like a kind of summary or a guide to Savarkar's thinking for people who are interested in Savarkar. That I will do again with Ambedkar also. Anyway, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And if you are interested in this kind of work, not like merely consuming but actively contributing to this kind of work, you can join Savarkar and Ambedkar study circle. You can connect with us on Twitter at SASC_India. वहाँ पे form भी है. You can fill up that form if you want to join the circle. Anyway, I think this was very beneficial for me. Uh, this was something new that I tried because आप लोगों को भी who are interested in Savarkar, I think most of you are familiar with the discussion around Savarkar. Mostly it is like historical कि सावरकर की लाइफ के बारे में ये इम्पोर्टेंट है, सावरकर ने ये किया. The attempt here today was to raise Savarkar from history to philosophy. I think I have been somewhat successful. इसके आगे जो भी है, I will be writing that text and I will be sharing that in the group, and we will also be sharing that from our account. So, can we consider? Are there any more questions?
So, Priyank, what I was mentioning was, so basically, when you mentioned political, cultural, social,
हाँ. Hmm.
so we were thinking about Gandhi Savarkar, right? Like, so basically, can we consider these as North Star, where socially both are there,
हाँ.
culturally, Gandhi might have done a lot of getting people together,
Hmm.
and
Uh,
hmm,
हाँ, मैं समझ गया आपका क्वेश्चन. ये एक्चुअली प्रॉपर इंटेलेक्चुअल वर्क है. इसके लिए एक न्यू इंटेलेक्चुअल हिस्ट्री ऑफ गांधी, न्यू इंटेलेक्चुअल हिस्ट्री ऑफ सावरकर, बहुत सारा काम होना भी बाकी है. बट सुपरफिशियल लेवल पे जो मैंने बोला, मुझे वही लगता है कि इनमें से कुछ पर्सनैलिटीज़ का वी विल हैव टू लाइक गिव अप ऑन देयर पॉलिटिकल आइडियाज़ एंड मे बी इम्बाइव देयर सोशल आइडियाज़. एंड फॉर सम ऑफ देम आई थिंक जैसे सावरकर हैं, तो उनका रेदर देन जस्ट पॉलिटिकल जैसा अभी हमारा चलता रहा है, उनका एक मोर फुलसम, ए मोर होलसम आउटलुक आई थिंक निकल के सामने आएगा. उसके लिए
hmm,
बहुत सारे इंटेलेक्चुअल काम की भी ज़रूरत है.
hmm.
Okay, thank you everyone. I hope you learned something from this presentation. Thanks a lot.